I am now joined in studio by a prominent figure of the 2015 Fees Must Fall University protests. The Vice Chancellor of Witwatersrand University, Adam Habib, has recently released a book on his view of the student protests that erupted at Wits in Johannesburg. And then, of course, we do know they spread to campuses nationwide back in 2015. The book looks at a critical view of the student movement and details the intimate engagements of Professor Habib with the students, and for more on this, I'm joined by the professor himself. Prof, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
I mean, 2015, so it's essentially been around 3 years since you were at this eye of the storm in which we saw this unprecedented move of students around the country protesting for essentially what should be a basic right to everyone, and that being education. I mean, 3 years later, would you agree in saying that the situation or the issues largely remain unresolved?
Well, I think that there's some improvement. So what you do know is in the end of 2017, Jacob Zuma passed a resolution that essentially allowed anybody with a family income of less than 350,000 to be paid for at a university. And that includes both tuition and accommodation. That, by the way, is rare in the world. I think that the only place that happens is in Scandinavia. Sure. Even in Germany, when they have free education, they mean tuition, not accommodation and subsistence. So that's been done. But that covers about 40% of the university system. If a place like Wits, those that qualify for that scholarship would be about 22%. The vast majority of our students we would describe as missing in the middle. They're
sure.
richer than 350, but cannot afford it. And that's about 65% of our student base. And that's where the problem remains. And so in that sense, it's not been resolved. I do worry that the continuous instability at our universities is dangerous. And I think we'll lose our universities, these great public institutions. And frankly, you're never going to be addressing poverty and inequality and even growth unless you use those institutions in the ways that they are meant to be used. And continuous instability is not in our interest.
No, for sure. But that step taken by government so far, do you think it's sustainable?
Well, there is a real debate about this.
Right.
So between you and me at the moment, it comes in the region, what they had initially estimated, it will be about 57 billion rand additional per annum. They now estimate that it's slightly higher, maybe even 30 billion higher. Sure. And so the big question is, it really depends what happens with the economy. If you jumped from 0.8% to 2.5%, 3%, I think this is easily payable. You might then ask whether we should have spent it here rather than in early childhood development or something else. But frankly, it's payable if the economy improves. If it doesn't, then you've got a real challenge. And I think that's what people should be worried about, is if we can turn the economy, this is perfectly doable. If you can't turn the economy, then you're going to confront a real crisis down the line.
I mean, what's interesting about the insights that you give us in your book, Prof, is the insights into the students and the actual character of the students. I mean, you essentially describe them as having one persona in front of the public or in front of the media and another persona when engaging with you directly. Why do you think that was?
Well, I do worry about this because it seems to me that our students, leaders at least, have learned lessons from our politicians, which is to say one thing in the public domain and say another thing privately. And I think that's a very dangerous politics. Our politicians and our political activists think that this is clever politics. I think it's a duplicitous politics because you land up saying this is why we are in the mess we're in at the moment. You had ANC politicians speaking free education for 20 years when effectively they were cutting the very subsidies to higher education itself, and that has got us into the mess. I have seen so often activist leaders being charming, in fact, great individuals in one-to-one interaction. And when they're in the public domain, they behave like demagogues. And the problem with that is they create a very duplicitous politics. And they create a circumstance where nobody trusts politicians because you take it for granted that they lie. And I think that's a very dangerous thing to happen in a democracy itself.
I mean, obviously, you'll appreciate that some of the students feel differently. I mean, I engaged with some students at WITS, and they actually had a very interesting view in that even yourself, sir, as Prof, you had a certain view or a certain image you projected in the media, and to them you were someone completely different.
So my image, and this is why I wrote the book, what I try to project, and whether I succeed is a different matter, but what I try to project is to say, look, I think this is an important social struggle. I think it's important to bring down the cost of higher education. I think it's important that the students have achieved in 10 days what vice chancellors had been debating in 10 years.
Sure.
Having said that, I do not condone the burning of infrastructure. I do not condone violent politics. And frankly, I do not condone the attempt to continuously shut down the universities. I think it's not in the interest of South Africa, and I don't think it's in the interest of the vast majority of students. And frankly, I'm not going to lie about this. This book is very clear. If I was put in exactly the same conditions in 2016, where people are threatening to burn down the place, where they are being violent, I will call in the police. I'm not going to lie about this. I'm not going to be duplicitous about this. They don't like that. They've said to me, we'd like you to suggest that that was wrong. And I'm saying, no, it wasn't. Mm-hmm. When you start saying, I believe in free education, and now I want to burn buildings down in the cause of free education, that is just unacceptable. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to be very clear about this. So I do understand that sometimes when you engage in the public discourse, there's a measure of imagery you create. Mm. But that has to be within margins. If you say one thing in public and you say the direct opposite when you're quiet, well, then I think that that's just duplicitous politics. And frankly, I think some of our most venal politicians actually have done this. If you look at all of the criticism of Jacob Zuma and many of the other politicians, that's precisely how they behave. They talk about empowerment and then they enable state capture. Mm. That's the kind of problem that we have to stop. And it seems to me we must be honest about that.
Sure. I mean, Prof, you say that the students managed to essentially achieve in 10 days what institutions have struggled to do so in 10 years. One can't not look at the fact that this was driven largely by the violence, the unfortunate part of it, of course. But was that violence not what got the change going?
I don't think so. I think the book is very clear that actually the great success point of this movement was in 2015 when Jacob Zuma made the first concession. Right. And that was largely peaceful. It was the March on Parliament, it was multiracial, it was white and black, rich and poor, and all shades in between actually participated in a common human struggle. And they got huge support. In 2016, when the movement factionalized, factions became racist, and it became more violent. Sure. And in that context, there was actually not only did they lose support, but they forced universities to bring in police, to bring in security, etc. And therefore, 2016 was far more violent than 2015. And the question is why? Because actually the movement morphed into something else. Because as politicians tried to get their clutches on what they saw as a successful movement, they factionalized it. And when they factionalized it, they lost the broader goal. You know, in 2016, I went to a poll. I know it was very controversial, but I went to a poll at Wits University. 78% of the students said, we would like to complete the academic year. 92% of staff. If you are the student leadership, you're meant to reflect those student views. How is it that the leadership refused to reflect their own constituent views? And it took the Vice Chancellor to intervene and say, enough is enough, we're going to complete the academic year. That, I think, is what we have to learn from this lesson. There's many social struggles to be had. But the lesson of this book is learn that. Non-racial struggles are important. Violence in a democracy is unacceptable. There are parameters that we have to establish. Our constitution is very clear that protest must be allowed. Sure. But it is also very clear on what is legitimate protest and what is illegitimate protest. And I think you can't demand the rights of the constitution and not take on its responsibilities. And I think there were some factions in the student movement that did precisely that.